Okay, thank you very much. My name is Chuck Fuscello. I am the President and CEO of the Alzheimer's Foundation of America, and I want to welcome all of you to our Educating America tour. We started this tour a couple of years ago. We've been traveling throughout the entire country because we feel it's so critically important, the education of this disease as well. We're going to get started with working your brains right away. I know, don't say uh-oh, this is fun. Everybody has this in front of them? Turn it over. Mike, I'm going to ask you to give me 3 minutes on the screen.
Oh no, forget it.
We're going to hold it at 3. You're going to get 3 minutes to get as many answers as you possibly can. There are video cameras all around, so you can't cheat. We are watching you. We are also streaming live on Facebook. Is everybody ready? Is everybody ready?
No.
No, you're supposed to say, is everybody ready? Yes. Starting right now. So I just want to also announce why you're doing the puzzle. Keep your heads down looking at the puzzle because I want to see how many answers you can get. We are also offering free memory screenings today as well. Everybody say hello to Amanda to my left by the door over here. Hi, Amanda. Amanda will be performing the screenings today. If anybody wants, you can just go right through there where it says memory screenings. You're not alone. And she will give you a test. It's only 10 minutes. Go back to the puzzles.
With 2019's most popular palettes and new paint selection tools online and in store, the Home Depot is making finding your color
Minute 30.
easier than ever. Get a colorful new experience and everything you'll need to get started painting like Glidden Premium Interior, now just $18.98. The Home Depot. More saving, more doing.
If you can just forgive me all the things I said and did, I'll be good at forgetting how you hurt me way back when. Let's not try to make excuses. Let's just say hello again. Find some way of letting
30 seconds.
back under the bridge. People can
25.
change from the deepest cuts to the smallest thing.
15.
People can change
Pressure time.
from the color of a shirt to
10 seconds left.
the truth is that
5,
I can't go back.
4,
Erase the hurt and
2.
do the best and
Put your pens down.
I have Alzheimer's.
You don't. So how many people got 15 answers? How many people got 10?
They do these puzzles on.
5? Who got 1 answer? Who got no answers? Who got 0? Keep your hands up. Who got 0? Okay. So I'm going to show you a brief video about why it's challenging and why you probably shouldn't get any answers. Mike will show the video.
My name is Will Shorts. I'm crossword editor for the New York Times. This puzzle has a special story behind it.
Raise the volume.
Only one person knows all the answers. but she doesn't remember them anymore.
Alzheimer's is a devastating disease. We wanted to demonstrate its effects and show how the AFA can help. So we took a common hobby and transformed it into a way of experiencing the disease. First, we learned facts about patients' lives by interviewing their relatives.
My grandmother is Catherine. She had forgotten to feed the dog. She found a doll, named it. My dad's name is Richard. My name is Doug. Dad completely burned the fried chicken.
Then, we had Will Shorts create puzzles based on each patient's life and the answers they can no longer find. We worked with the biggest newspapers in the United States to have the puzzles covertly published, making enthusiasts struggle to find the simplest answers. In addition to the newspapers, a range of media drove people online, where they could learn more about how the AFA can provide support. We showed the effects of Alzheimer's through a crossword puzzle that not a single person can solve. We reached over 5 million newspaper readers, a total of 50 million adding other media. AFA saw a 159% increase in web traffic and another 62% in calls. And with unsolvable crossword puzzles, we helped many find the answers they needed.
So I was approached a few years ago by a public relations firm in New York City that specializes in healthcare. And they wanted to give back and donate their time, and they partnered with us, and they wanted to create a challenge, an initiative that would give individuals an opportunity to experience frustration, agitation, confusion for a period of time. Because if you're an enthusiast of crossword puzzles, you know that Will Short's puzzles in the New York Times are very challenging. So we came up with this, and we were honored to have Will Shorts be a partner with us. But this was something that we did throughout the entire country, and it was tremendously successful. It's still very active. It's called thehardestcrossword.com, and if you go on the internet, you could see who the 3 individuals are that were interviewed that are currently living with dementia in their lives. So unless you know them, you really can't solve the puzzle. But for a brief period of time, you could experience some confusion and some agitation because you can't solve the puzzle. So I want to thank all of you for being here. This is very important to us that we have educational conferences throughout the entire country. I want to talk to you a little bit about AFA and what we do as soon as the PowerPoint presentation comes up. Thanks, Mike. So our mission at AFA is to provide the support, the counseling, the guidance that we feel is so critically important to the more than 5 million people that are living with the disease. We were founded as a place to go for guidance, counseling, and support. We were founded by a caregiver who is our board chairman right now. He's the founding member of AFA. And back in the 80s and 90s, he was caring for his mom. And at that time, nobody talked about Alzheimer's disease. He had no places to turn to, no resources to turn to. And he talks about it today, how he felt he did everything wrong at that time. But he founded AFA because he wanted to make sure that nobody goes on this journey alone. So back in 2002, we were founded. But he went through some challenges himself. He'd walk out of the kitchen, go into the living room, come back, and his mom would yell at him. And he didn't know how to handle it because nobody educated him on what to expect and how to deal with it. He would take his dad to the movies, come back, and she would yell at him. You know, where are you? You've abandoned me. But even before that, he noticed something different. He was living in New York, and his parents were living in Florida. And he noticed the change in behavior of his mom. And what really was the tip of the iceberg is when his mother called him up and said, Bert, his name is Bert Brodsky, I saved you money. I took Dad to a doctor, and it only cost $1 for the copayment. Now, we knew there was something wrong with that. He found out that she took him to a clinic for pediatrics, for children. So what he wanted to do then was put a healthcare worker in the house, and his mother refused to do it. He took a very drastic step. He sued his parents. And he walked, he walked into a courtroom, and the judge said, Brodsky versus Brodsky, this was in Florida, how much money is involved? And he said, Your Honor, there's no money involved. And he looked at him, he said, Mr. Brodsky, you're from New York. There's always money involved when it's families in Florida. And he explained to him what he wanted to do for his parents at no cost. And the judge looked at his mom and said, Mrs. Brodsky, don't let the court make a decision for you. This is what your son wants to do, and she agreed to do it. So after a period of time, he knew he had to bring them back to New York to live closer to him. And then she passed away in the early 90s, and that's when he went on this journey himself. Very successful businessman, grew up in the Bronx, one bedroom with his mom and dad, his brother, and his grandmother. And he's very proud of his roots. He talks about how he shared a cot and the floor in the kitchen with his brother as growing up. Became a very successful businessman throughout the entire country, many businesses, and wanted to give back, and this is the way he does it. And we're very proud of the fact that he's still very much active in the foundation. So today, what do? Part of what our model is care, education, and research. And why we travel around the country? Because of the prevalence of the disease. Nearly 5.7 million people are living with Alzheimer's today. And if you use a multiplier of 3 or 4, you could see how widespread it is in this country. In your state alone, more than 110,000 people are living with the disease. And this number is expected to triple by 2060. By 2060, this number is expected to triple. So our network has grown from when we first started as a hotline, as a resource center, it's now a helpline, to nearly 3,000 member offices nationwide throughout the entire country. Some of them are here today, they're in the back of the room. This is why we bring these services, because you need to know where to go in your own local communities. So please visit our exhibitors that are here today. Our programs include a national toll-free helpline, national memory screening, which Amanda will give today. Say hello to Amanda again. Hello, Amanda. We offer free monthly educational webinars as well as telephone-based support groups if you can't make them. I won't turn the slide till you take the picture. Did you get it? Okay. We've also trained more than 19,000 people in our dementia training, and we're approved in 40 states to offer continuing education to licensed social workers. Our memory screening division is about a decade old. We've screened more than 5 million people nationwide. So here's the question. Who's afraid to get screened today? Who's honest to answer that they're afraid to get screened today? Amanda's a very nice person. She'll work you through this. Nobody will know your score or your baseline, and she'll talk to you about other programs and services that can follow up. Our helpline is staffed by licensed social workers that are dementia specifically trained. It's a national toll-free helpline. No volunteers, 7 days a week, AFA staff only, full and part-time employees as well. Part of our mission is to give back to our nearly 2,900 member offices in the form of grants. We give back more than $1 million a year in support of 5 grant cycles a year if you're a member of AFA, and we also fund research. And these are some of the research facilities that we fund throughout the entire world, as far as Israel as well, to the Hadassah Medical Organization there also. Our public policy and division does one thing and one thing only: fights for more research dollars every single day on the Hill in Washington, and also to support caregivers and fund programs and services throughout the entire country. And when you think about the cost of caring, it's so critically important that we have an advocacy division in Washington, because it costs more than $250 billion a year to support this disease, to support individuals that you care tremendously about. An initiative we started nearly 6 years ago is Light the World in Teal, which is our Alzheimer's awareness color. This year alone, more than 300 buildings throughout the entire world will be lighting up on November 7th, and we're still getting more. Very excited about that, because that cost, this building will be lit up on November 7th in Teal as well. By the way, I am afraid of heights. I have no idea why my staff scheduled it here, but you're not going to see me too close to the windows.
It's the most sought-after place in Seattle.
And I think it's beautiful for those who want to be here.
If you want to be frustrated, anybody can just come and drive in Seattle and feel how it is to try to do a puzzle.
To try to do a puzzle. Well, drive in New York City, where I'm from, you want to get frustrated, that's frustrated. But this initiative is very important to us, and as I said, this building would be lit up in Teal, and these are some of the buildings and landmarks throughout the entire world that have lit up previously. And it starts a discussion about this, and then we get people to talk about Alzheimer's disease. We get them to seek out and call our helpline, our 866 number, anywhere throughout the entire country, because we want people to seek help, because you can't do this alone. And that's so critically important. We've been traveling around the country this year alone. In the last 3 years, when we finish this year, our next stop is in New Jersey, which is easy for me, from New York. But I don't care, because we want to be everywhere. We will have completed traveling to 40 states, and next year we'll complete the cycle, and then the following year in 2021 we'll start over again. We don't charge anybody for the conferences. We don't charge people for our programs and services. If somebody donates to AFA and it's dedicated to research, 100% of that goes into a dedicated account. 88 cents of every other dollar goes to our programs and services, and we're very proud of that. My staff may call me cheap, but I believe I'm just fiscally conservative and respectful of the dollars, because it's so critically important that at what we get, we give back as much as we possibly can. Every single day, we strive to do more today than we did yesterday. Again, I want to thank all of you for being here. We have a great lineup today, and it's important. So thanks so much for being here. We're going to kick it off with our keynote speaker, who's Dr. Charles Bernick, and we're so excited that Dr. Bernick is here. He's the clinical professor of neurology in the Memory and Brain Wellness Center at the University of Washington. Previously, he was associated as the Associate Director of the Cleveland Clinic Lou Ruvo Center for Brain Health, which is a member of AFA, and Dr. Jeff Cummings, who heads it up, is on our medical advisory board. Dr. Bernick received his medical degree from the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School and has researched Alzheimer's disease and treatments for more than 25 years. We're very excited that he's going to present an overview of Alzheimer's disease, an update of research and clinical trials, and what's to expect on the horizon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Bernick. Thank you, Dutch.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. I really appreciate AFA for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. My job is really to start by giving you just an overview of where we are with Alzheimer's disease. And I probably won't touch on everything. We'll hopefully leave some time for questions for more specific issues that you're interested in. So to begin with, I think it's important to put Alzheimer's disease in a historical framework, because a lot of people think, well, is this a new disease? We're hearing so much about it now and hadn't heard about it that much. But I did some research on this, and I actually was able to identify the first citation of memory problems. This dates back a long time ago. I don't know if you could read it, but it's the first senior moment where this guy's saying, "Oh crap, was that today?" So this actually has been a long-standing issue. I mean, as far as we know, Alzheimer's disease dates back, as far as we know. Of course, it's a disease of aging, so we didn't see it as prevalent until people started to age, as we have in our society today. So one issue that comes up is this inevitable? In other words, if you live long enough, are we all going to have Alzheimer's disease, or at least some memory problems? And it turns out it's certainly very common. So if you just look at people over the age of 65, about 1 in 10 have it. But it is age-related. And if you start looking at people over the age of 85 or 90, now you get actually the majority of people having either Alzheimer's disease or some form of dementia. So it is very common. It's not inevitable. Some people are very successful agers and don't get it, but it is a very common problem. And that does lead to this issue of that our society is going to be just seeing more and more cases of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, and it's really becoming a public health issue. Now, one of the other important points is, well, what's normal aging? So if we know that memory problems are very common as you get older, how do you know when you're really starting to have a problem? And this is what we know about normal aging. And by the way, we know this by taking individuals who they've been tested in studies and they seem to be functioning really fine. They don't seem to have any drop-off on their memory. And then they pass away and we look at the brain. And we make sure they don't have any diseases. And if you look at those people and see how they perform over time, this is what happens. So you do slow down as you get older. So your speed of processing information is slower, takes longer. If I gave you a test, if I gave somebody who's 40-year-old a test and somebody who's 80, the 80-year-old will be slower in doing the test. And words may stay on the tip of the tongue a little longer, things like that. But you really don't lose it. So there's some minor changes in memory with normal aging, but it's really not significant. And most of the other cognitive abilities, your ability to make judgments, to reason, to plan, your language abilities, these stay intact with normal aging. So, if those things are starting to drop off, then that should be a red flag or a warning that something else is going on. That's not, so if you're seeing more than this, that's not normal aging. What about dementia? I will tell you, over my career, over 30 or more years in Alzheimer's disease, far and away the most common question we get is, what's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? And it is a little tricky. I mean, it's because people use these terms interchangeably when they're really not. So dementia, just to kind of get right on everybody on the same path, dementia is a term we use to describe a person who's declined in their memory and other abilities, that's reached the point that they can't function independently. So it's a descriptive term. In some sense, it's a term of severity. Dementia can be caused by a lot of things. It could be by Alzheimer's disease, that's in fact the most common, but it can be caused by strokes, it could be caused by brain tumors, it could be caused by vitamin deficiencies, it can be caused by depression, it could be caused by drugs you're taking. So dementia, just keep in mind, dementia is a descriptive term. It's not a disease. What you really want to know is, what's the disease that's causing the dementia? So that's the important distinction. Alzheimer's disease is a disease. And as we'll talk about in just a minute, most of Alzheimer's disease, you're not demented. You don't have dementia. That's actually the last part of the disease. So again, dementia is a descriptive term. It's a term of severity. It's not a disease. Now, as I just mentioned, dementia and memory loss can be due to a lot of different conditions. So if somebody is having memory changes, they're declining in their cognitive function, you can't assume that that's Alzheimer's disease. And you shouldn't, because stress, anxiety, depression can mimic it, can give you the same symptoms. If you're sleep deprived, you could have the same symptoms. Medications can cause it, certain ones that even are over the counter. Things like Benadryl, for example, or other drugs you might not even think about, things you're taking for your heart or for your bladder. Other medical conditions can, and so on. So this is just a list. Alcohol can, by the way. So the point here is that if somebody is having memory changes, cognitive changes, your first step should be to get a diagnosis. That's the first step, because everything else flows from there. And you can't, again, assume that it's Alzheimer's disease. Might be, but you have to make that diagnosis first. So what is Alzheimer's disease? So many of you know it. I'm just going to talk a little bit first about the clinical features of it, what it manifests as, and then we'll talk a little bit about the disease process in the brain. So the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is memory, generally, memory loss, loss of short-term memory. So the phenomenon that you can remember what you did when you were in grade school, but can't remember what you ate last night for dinner, is the common situation. So it's short-term memory, it's recent memory, it's learning new information, getting that new remote control and not being able to figure out kind of how to use it. But then other things can get involved too. So language abilities, for example. Knowing what you really want to say but can't find the word. Or it could be visual spatial abilities. Getting lost when you're driving because you can't remember quite where you went and you can't remember the spatial orientation of things. Now, there are forms, by the way, of Alzheimer's disease that don't start with memory. There are variants. These are rare, but some start with visual changes, some start with behavioral changes, some start with language changes. So there are some kind of permutations or spin-offs of the classic form. But in general, Alzheimer's presents with memory and executive problems, executive being higher levels of processing. Now, over time, things decline. It is a progressive disease. That rate of progression is variable. So you can look at averages, but that probably doesn't help you as a particular individual. But it is a progressive disease, and we don't have a cure at this moment. Now, This slide really represents what I think is probably the biggest change in our field over the last 30 or 40 years. And that is the recognition that Alzheimer's disease is actually a very long process, beginning years before you even have symptoms. I may have Alzheimer's disease. My mother did. So we know there's this long lag time of when changes are starting in the brain. And then eventually, people do start showing symptoms. They're very minor, subtle. Yeah, is that really a problem if we can't remember where you parked the car? Or would you put your keys down, you don't know where you put them? Is that the start of Alzheimer's disease? Could be. But of course, Alzheimer's disease is progressive. So over time, those little things start to get more and more and more. And then eventually somebody does develop dementia, but that's way down the line. So Alzheimer's disease itself in the brain can span over 20, 30 years. The good news about that is that it gives us a window of opportunity to potentially intervene. And the point here, then, is the earlier you're diagnosed, probably the better opportunity you have to change the trajectory of the disease. Again, we don't cure it, but there is reason to think that you can actually change the trajectory of the disease. So let's talk a little bit about really what's happening in the brain. So if you look at a brain of somebody with Alzheimer's disease, the volume of it, the size of it is smaller. So you've lost cells in the brain. But what's happening really underneath that? So one of the things we know is that, and maybe the first thing that happens, is that we lose the connections, we call them synapses, but really the connections between the cells start to malfunction. And so the communication between cells start to deteriorate. And as part of that communication, your body, well, the cells communicate by producing chemicals or neurotransmitters. We call them neurotransmitters. And many of these really become quite deficient. One of the main one is called acetylcholine. Keep that in mind because that's really has been the main target of our treatment so far. But there's other neurotransmitters that are affected as well. So it's not just acetylcholine. And that's why just taking a medicine doesn't cure the disease. So we see these loss of connections. The hallmark, though, is actually a buildup of certain proteins in the brain. One is called beta amyloid, and that makes up the plaques in Alzheimer's disease that you hear about. And the other protein is called tau, T-A-U. And that's part of the cell skeleton. And both these proteins, we all have them, but for some reason, Alzheimer's disease, they get misfolded. They take on a different shape, which is the body can't clear, and they start to accumulate. And the thought is that either people produce too much beta amyloid, this is often from genetic reasons, or they can't clear it, they can't remove it as well. And so it just starts to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. The amyloid is the first thing that we see occur in the brain, and then eventually we see the tau. The tau is really most associated with the progression of the disease. And as we're thinking about targets of treatment, both amyloid and tau have been one of the strategies that's being used, in research at least. Okay, so what do we know about beta amyloid? Well, again, this is a protein. We all have it. It's part of a longer protein. We call it the Alzheimer's precursor protein. And that larger protein gets snipped and cleaved. And so you get a little fragment, and that's the beta amyloid. The thing about the beta amyloid, though, it likes to clump together. So it has that tendency. Now, again, usually your body is able to remove it. But in Alzheimer's disease, either because you produce too much of it or you lose that capacity to remove it, it starts to accumulate and develop these plaques. But it turns out, by the way, that one of the theories now is it's not the plaques that's the problem. It's that beta amyloid as it's accumulating, as it's floating around in the bloodstream. So this is really kind of a picture of what we think happens in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. So this amyloid starts to accumulate, maybe when you're in your 50s. Then body kind of reacts to it. You start getting some inflammation in the brain. Then you get these tangles of the tau protein. Then you start having symptoms. And then eventually, 30 years, 20 years later, you have dementia. So again, it's a long process, a lot of opportunity to potentially intervene early. So can we ever know if somebody truly has Alzheimer's disease? Probably you've heard this, is that, well, you can't really know, unless you look at the brain at autopsy. That was true in the past, but probably not now. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Probably the biggest game changer, like Russell Wilson here in Seattle, has been some of the new techniques to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. And that's what we call PET amyloid imaging, or spinal fluid measurements of these two proteins, amyloid and tau. And I'll talk a little bit about it. So this slide, I don't know if you can all see it, but if you look on the, let's see, it would be your left, that shows a picture, an MRI scan of the brain. An MRI just shows you the structure of the brain. If you look all the way to your right, that's an amyloid PET scan. The way we do it is we inject a dye that can attach to amyloid. And we can actually image that dye. It has a tracer on it. So what you're seeing is on the bottom a normal scan, a person who has no amyloid in their brain. And then on the top, somebody who actually has Alzheimer's disease. And you can see that the way it's displayed is that the warmer the color, the more amyloid there is. And you can see that that person just is chock full of amyloid. And this is a person who's having just mild symptoms. You already can see this. So this does allow us, in some sense, to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. The problem here, there's two problems. One is that as people age, we've found that you can have amyloid and not seem to be symptomatic. That is, some normal people who you happen to do these scans on for studies will have amyloid. Now, if you follow them for another 10 years or 20 years, would they get worse? That's the question. We don't know that. So in older people, hard to know exactly what it means. The other problem, frankly, is financial. At the moment, Medicare doesn't cover this. No insurances cover this. And it's like $6,000 to do. We do it. I mean, we have the capacity to do it here in Seattle. But just because of the price, we generally don't do it. But it is available. It's a way that we can identify people who are going to develop Alzheimer's disease with high likelihood. The other way we can measure these proteins is by looking at the spinal fluid. So the spinal fluid is, kind of circulates, and is in contact with the brain, and we could sample it through a lumbar puncture. And we can measure amyloid and tau. And what this chart shows is a study that was done where, so at the start, at point 0, what you're seeing are individuals who are having mild symptoms, and it divides that group into two. One group who has normal spinal fluid, and the other which has the abnormal amyloid and tau. The one that has the abnormal amyloid and tau is the one that has that stair step down. So in other words, if you take a group of people, you just do their spinal fluid test, you can predict with high accuracy who's going to develop Alzheimer's disease at least 5 years out. So we can diagnose the disease. Again, nobody covers these tests at the moment, but they are available. As far as what do you do, so okay, we can diagnose the disease. And by the way, as I said, we don't do these tests, so how do we make a diagnosis if we don't do these tests? And the diagnosis is often made by a combination of things. One is having a course that's consistent with Alzheimer's disease. That is that gradual memory change that worsens over time, and no other conditions that can explain it is present. That we have imaging of the brain, and there are some markers on the MRI scan that are consistent with Alzheimer's disease. They're not diagnostic. And then there's even another type of scan, a PET scan, that looks at brain activity, and that can be helpful. So with all this information together, we don't do too badly even without these amyloid tests. It's just that with the amyloid test, you can diagnose the disease very early. So once we make a diagnosis, then what do you do? Well, from a medical standpoint, it's pretty straightforward because there's not that many drugs. In fact, there's only two classes of medicines. So one are called cholinesterase inhibitors. The common ones are donepezil or Aricept, galantamine, which is Razidine, that's the brand name, or Exelon rivastigmine, which is usually taken as a patch. So all these drugs, these three, increase this acetylcholine in the brain. Helps the brain function better. Does not change the disease process. So whether you take it or you don't take it, the disease is going to progress. But it allows the brain to function better throughout that time. People are able to maintain abilities more and longer, even though they do go down a hill. Then there's the other drug that's available, and that's memantine or Namenda. Now that's indicated for people with moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease. It works by a different mechanism, but there have been studies that show the combination of Namenda and Aricept, or any of those cholinesterase inhibitors, in moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease does seem to be beneficial and have more benefit than each one separately. This just shows, I don't know if you can all see it, kind of what these symptomatic therapies are expected to do. So the chart there on the right is just from one of the studies. All the studies, by the way, are pretty consistent. So you start out, the two groups start out, those that take the drug and those that don't. And you can see that the red line, which is those that take the drug, actually improve. They improve for a while, and then they start getting worse. People that don't take the drug, that are given a placebo, they kind of hang in there a little bit, and then they start going down. But if you notice at the end point, there is a difference in how people score and test and how they function between those that take the medicine and those that don't. So even though everybody does eventually go downhill, it kind of buys you time. It buys you up to a year in terms of function. So it is a standard of care. It's not a cure, but we think it is appropriate, really, if you can tolerate it, to be on these medications. So where do we stand, though, with research, coming up with new drugs, new therapies? And unfortunately, there hasn't been a new drug on the market for 20 years. Almost 20 years, not quite. So that's not very encouraging. But it isn't due to lack of trying. Last year, in 2018, there were over 100 drugs that were tested or in testing in some phase. Whether it's the start, there's 3 phases of testing, 1, 2, and 3. So among all those phases of testing, there's over 100 drugs. So there's a lot of activity going on. Initially, when we did studies in Alzheimer's disease, we were looking at drugs that would improve symptoms, that are symptomatic drugs. Now the approach is for disease-modifying therapy. By that, I mean these are drugs that actually will impact the amyloid, the tau, the disease process itself, and slow down the disease. And there's just a lot of activity going on. Here in Seattle, we're fortunate enough to be part of many of these studies. Jessica, back at our table, can share some of the information about it. Keep in mind, the University of Washington, again, you should be proud, is one of the Alzheimer's disease research centers funded by the NIH. There's only about 30 or so in the country. So there's a lot of activity going on. We're in the midst of it. And I would actually encourage people to think about participating in research. Everybody complains about the FDA. They're not letting out drugs. They're too slow. Well, I'll tell you, the reason research is so slow is it takes so long to get people to volunteer and complete a study. That's the rate-limiting step. So I think if we had more participation, more involvement, we would get some of these studies done quicker and get an answer sooner. Now, what about complementary therapies? So drugs are good, but certainly they're not the answer, at least at this point. But there may be other things you can do from a lifestyle standpoint that are helpful and may impact the disease and may slow the trajectory. And so I want to spend a little time on some of these things because you hear about it so much. You just watch TV and you see ads for Prevagen and get these other things, and so you kind of wonder, do these things do anything? These over-the-counter, brain boosters and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk about a few things. One are phytochemicals, or really these are kind of dietary things. Curcumin, or turmeric, resveratrol, coconut oil, marijuana. People talk about vitamins, should there be extra vitamins and so on. So what do we know about these? Well, I'll kind of go through these things briefly. Although the bottom line is we really don't have any evidence for any of these. I mean, for anything, as it turns out. Now, they have a good rationale. So curcumin, or turmeric, the idea behind that is it's an antioxidant, anti-inflammatory drug, reduces inflammation in the brain and probably the body. And this came from the research that showed that the incidence of Alzheimer's disease in India is lower than most countries. So people say, well, why is that? I mean, why should that be? So you'd think, okay, well, maybe it could be genetic, but maybe it's something in their environment. And so people started looking at diets, and that's how this curcumin thing came about. But at the moment, there's no study showing curcumin has any protective effects in the brain. We don't know what dose of curcumin you should take. So I'm not suggesting you don't use it in cooking and stuff. It's just that we don't have any evidence to suggest taking, supplements or such with it. Resveratrol comes from the grapes. You can find it in wine, although the amount of resveratrol that's in wine would necessitate you drinking probably a case or so a day. Now it'd be a lot of fun, but I don't think it would offset the other bad part of that. But anyway, so resveratrol, there has been a study of resveratrol in the United States, and it was kind of marginal, the benefit. The study actually stopped because the company, it was down at the time where the economy dropped and the company went out of business. But people still have a thought about this. Resveratrol is an antioxidant. You can find it in some supplements, but again, at the moment, right now, we just don't know enough about it, again, the dose and such, to recommend it. Coconut oil is kind of based on the idea of medium-chain fatty acids. Your body or your brain can kind of utilize them better than most forms of fatty acids. But again, there's no evidence for it. And there's actually some commercial products that are like it, but they've never really taken off because the benefit has never really been shown to be that great. So I wouldn't recommend coconut oil. Now, marijuana, of course, is the big thing. I mean, one of the big things people are always more interested in because, well, it's available. And, you hear about that it's good for a lot of different things, or cannabinoids that are in marijuana. And the real limitation of this is there's just so little research. And that has to do with the regulations of marijuana in terms of even testing. So we don't know. Certainly we know that the younger people that use marijuana, particularly with the THC, actually it has a negative cognitive effect. But whether certain cannabinoids may be helpful or whatever is just not known. So until we get research about this, I mean really good research, we just don't know. There has been some evidence of vitamin E at high doses in Alzheimer's disease. The only thing you have to be careful with is there was some suggestion that high doses of vitamin E may actually have a negative effect on your heart if you have heart disease. So I would talk with your physician about that if you're interested. And then the omega-3 fatty acids, these are things like in fish or fish oil. Again, has some preliminary evidence that there was a benefit, but it really, the value in Alzheimer's disease hasn't been proven. So again, to sum up all this is that these type of things have not really been shown to have any success. And keep in mind about over-the-counter medications. There's not a requirement that these drugs be tested formally and through the FDA. So they're not regulated. You don't know what you're getting when you buy some of these things. And there's been studies that you probably know this, studies where they actually somebody independently analyzes what's in the pill, and it's not exactly what they say on the label. So just be careful about using over-the-counter medications, and also make your physician aware of what you're doing, because some of these can interact with prescription drugs. Now, I don't know, so it looks like this audience is probably of the age they remember the movie The Graduate. Is that right? Yeah. Maybe we could cue up, this is a famous scene from The Graduate. Yeah, yeah.
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
Exactly how do you mean?
There's a great future in plastics. Think about it. Will you think about it?
Yes, I will.
Enough said. That's a deal.
Okay, so that's a plastic scene. And I just show that because the brain has plasticity. And this is really kind of an interesting thing. A lot of people think, once your brain is formed and you have all these cells, then it just kind of, it's all downhill after that. You just kind of deteriorate. It's not true. You can actually continue to form new connections in the brain, new branching in the brain. You have stem cells in the brain. Not many, but you have them. And you can remodel the brain. You can form new connections throughout your life. And we know that there are certain lifestyle things that can help that. So we'll talk about that. So first, I just want to make a point of one of the most important things in treatment is actually taking care of other medical problems. Diabetes, high blood pressure. These are things that are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So if you're not on top of those, if you're not spending time taking care of those, treating Alzheimer's disease is not going to get you that far. So you need to take care of all these things. What about exercise? Well, exercise probably has the most evidence for a benefit. So exercise has the most evidence that we have for benefit. We know that exercise stimulates stem cells in the brain. We know you can produce these protective chemicals. They're called nerve growth factors. We've actually shown on MRI scans that people that exercise have higher volumes of the brain. It preserves volume. So the thought is you're either protecting cells or their connections. There's clinical trial evidence of exercise, aerobic exercise. And we know that people who exercise has a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. So there's just so much abundant evidence. Why aren't people, isn't everybody exercising? Because you should. And the dose of exercise we're not sure of, but the recommendation generally now is 30 minutes a day of something that gets your heart rate up to about 70% of its maximum. Don't have to worry about that specifically, but at least where you kind of feel like you're exerting yourself. And at least 4 days a week. So at the moment, that's the recommended exercise. You can do more. You want to check with your doctor if you haven't been exercising before you do it. But there's more evidence about exercise to help Alzheimer's disease, and even people with the disease. So not only to delay it, but also if you have it. How about diet? So we talked about some of the, supplements like curcumin and stuff. But what about just your diet in general? And most people, I think there's general agreement that this MIND diet, which is really a Mediterranean type diet, is one to try to emulate or try to shoot for. Green leafy vegetables, berries of all type, dried fruit, the fish, omega-3 fatty acids. And combining these are elements that have antioxidants in them, they have anti-inflammatory properties. And again, we know people that follow diets like this have a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. What about cognitive training? So, we talked about, we started right off on a crossword puzzle, so that was good. But there actually is some evidence that cognitive training may actually improve the connections and pathways in the brain. We know that people that are more cognitively stimulated have a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. And there's a whole industry now, as probably you know, of these computer programs. So Lumosity, Brain HQ, there's a whole ton of them. We do know you get better what you practice. So if you practice these games and the computer things, you're going to get better at them. Now, whether that actually changes the disease process is a different story. That hasn't been proven. But certainly there is enough reason to think about just staying mentally active, whether it's learning something new, a new hobby, a new language, a new instrument, whatever, where you actually are trying to challenge your brain. And I think there's a lot to suggest there's a usefulness to that. How about social connectedness or social engagement? So we know that people that are isolated have poorer health. And we know also, often with Alzheimer's disease, the patient and caregivers often will get isolated. Friends don't come by as much. They don't want to go out with them, so on and so forth, which is not good. Relationships are important. Married people live longer. Don't ask me why. I don't know. But yeah. But it's the same thing. The lack of social connectiveness seems to have a negative effect. And then, you know how it is. If you want to know about kind of successful aging, so you start asking somebody who's successfully aged. And so there's this famous one, this guy, Chris Mortensen, who made it to like over 110. And so he said, so friends, drinking lots of good water, no alcohol, staying positive, and lots of singing. So that was his recipe for success. And he probably, if he should have said exercise, he would have been right on. So I think trying to combine all these things, each one of these is going to have a little effect. But if you can do all of these things and incorporate all these things, then you may have a bigger effect that's important. I want to mention sleep. Sleep's a common problem in Alzheimer's disease. People, that's for a lot of reasons. Not only changes in the brain itself that affect the sleep-wake cycle. People get out of sync because they're not outside, they're not doing as much. Sometimes they're just inside watching television. So there's a lot of drugs sometimes affect sleep, even the ones we get for Alzheimer's disease, by the way. So a lot of things can affect sleep. But we think sleep might be a time where you can clear out some of these proteins. So it's important to try to get a good sleep pattern, which can be a challenge. But again, I think following good sleep hygiene, working with your physician, if there needs to be any additional sleep aids, although again, we try to avoid those and try to do it more naturally. But sleep is a goal to try to achieve. Good sleep. So I'm just going to finish up with this. And this, I think the whole idea here is that once a diagnosis is made of any dementia, it really is not just going to the doctor, seeing him for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it is these days, and getting a prescription and that's it. It really is, it's kind of a holistic type thing. So medications are part of it, but lifestyle is part of it, caregiver wellness is part of it, diet's part of it, and I think that's the way we need to really think about approaching Alzheimer's disease if we're going to be successful in slowing the trajectory and keeping people at their highest level of function they can be. So that's the summary. Alzheimer's disease is a long process. Early diagnosis is important. We can make a diagnosis early. A lot of drugs are in trials now, and a lot here in Seattle. And the lifestyle modifications are just crucial and need to be attacked if we're really going to be successful at treating this disease. So I'm going to stop there, and it looks like we have a few minutes for any questions that you all may have about either what I talked about or other things, because of course you couldn't cover everything. Okay. Yes. Absolutely. So the question was, or request was to talk a little bit more about the clinical trials. As I mentioned, this is, if we want new drugs, if we want new treatments, behavioral treatments, medical treatments, it's going to take the involvement of volunteers to participate in these things. So what's involved? Well, everything's really stacked up on your benefit. It may not seem that, but really the levels of protection that are put in by the FDA, by our university system, are exceptionally high, probably the highest in the world among any country. And these are things that, so everybody's, of course, are informed of what's involved in the study. You're never obligated to continue it. You are at least explained all the risks that we know of before. Now, most studies have two arms, people that are on the drug and people who aren't a placebo. And you're not going to know what you're taking, and we're not going to know what you're taking. That's the only way to really establish if a drug's effective. So that's part of the study. But you're usually never any worse off than when you started, because almost all the studies allow you to stay on the conventional drugs that are available. So you're always treated. And it's just that you're given something else that we think may have an additional benefit. And of course, the other thing, it's interesting. People have done studies of people who are in studies. And just being in study, even if you're on a placebo, people do better than those that aren't. Why is it? Well, maybe because the reason they seeked out the study is they're more proactive anyway in their health. Maybe they're getting closer follow-up than they normally would do with a regular doctor. Maybe a lot of reasons. But it is true that participating in a study seems to have a beneficial effect anyway in your general function. And if you have any other questions, again, I'd be happy to answer them, or Jessica can answer them as well in the back. Yes?
Can you give the contact information for signing up for studies?
So Jessica will raise her hand, and she has, so she can give you all that. I actually don't, my memory's not that good. I don't remember the actual number, but you can get all the information over there, and I'd encourage you all to do that. Yes?
As far as links, two questions, kind of, sort of. Is there anything with the modern medicines that we've had for a long time, are there anything that can counteract with other medications somebody might be taking, like a Lipitor or something like that with the cholesterol drugs? Now we know that high cholesterol isn't necessarily a killer, but that kind of thing. Oh, sorry. Yeah. The question is, are there any drug interactions with the Alzheimer's protocol drugs right now with anything else like Lipitor or cholesterol ceasing agents that people are taking? Is the first question.
Right, okay.
Second question would be, as far as when you see Alzheimer's in your family and the people that are developing them have completely different lifestyles, but it's a genetic link, and then is there also possibly a link with mercury?
Yeah.
And farming, things like we now know about Roundup and some of that.
So you're testing my memory to remember all those questions. But as we go through it, you'll remind me. So the first has to do with the interaction between Alzheimer's drugs and other things people are taking. And although most of the Alzheimer's drugs, the cholinesterase inhibitors and Namenda, are very safe, in other words, they themselves will not interfere with your innards, pretty much. Not that they don't have potential side effects. They generally don't have a lot of drug interactions. The only thing to watch for would be, because this increases acetylcholine, there are drugs that decrease acetylcholine, block it. So these are the common ones like oxybutynin, for example, which is used for bladder, and some of the actually antihistamines. So you have to be careful with some of those drugs because one will counteract the other. And the other thing that sometimes we're concerned about is if you're on, this is more theoretical, but not to be ignored. Donepezil, which is the most common drug for Alzheimer's disease, Aricept, can potentially slow the heartbeat down a little. So if you're on a drug that already is slowing your heartbeat down, metoprolol, propranolol, any of those, then you have to be a little cautious because you obviously don't want to bring their heart rate down to 40 or whatever. So there are little cautions, but in general, these are really relatively safe drugs that don't have a lot of drug interactions. Now, the question about the genetics and kind of this idea that you may do everything perfectly right and still get the disease. We know there's two genetic links to Alzheimer's disease. One is through what we call mutations. A mutation is an error on a gene, and you can pass that error down from generation to generation. If you inherit that error on the gene, you will get the disease 100%. Now, it turns out there's very few families where that occurs. In those families, usually the disease begins at an early age, 50s, for example, or early 60s. And you can see it in many generations. So that's mutations. That's not common. The other way genetics play a role is what we call susceptibility genes. So this is where a gene, an inheritable material, may have several forms that happen just normally in the population. But one of the forms confers a higher risk of a disease. Doesn't mean you're going to get the disease, but it shows that you're at higher risk. It probably changes some of the protein metabolism in the brain. The most common one for that is called apolipoprotein E. And there's a form of that, apolipoprotein E4, that does confer that higher risk. And that's probably the most common genetic factor. So yes, if you have a first-degree relative with the disease, parent, brother, sister, just statistically, you're at a higher risk of getting it. Doesn't mean you're going to, unless you have one of the mutations which you can test for. But it is an important factor. In fact, the two main risk factors of Alzheimer's disease are genetics and age, both of which at the moment you can't do anything about. Yes?
There are certain tests that are given by 23andMe, and one of the things that they tested on, that I got a result on, was Alzheimer's.
Yes.
And I don't know how valid that is. It said that I didn't carry those genes, but still had a 9% chance of getting Alzheimer's.
Well, so the question was with 23andMe, because you can now commercially get your genetic profile tested, and they do test for the ApoE4. So they will report that out to you, and if you are interested, you will know if you have that higher risk. So 23andMe is one way to get that information if you want it. But again, it's just a risk. I will say this, if you carry 2 copies of E4, the risk is really pretty high at some point that you're going to develop Alzheimer's disease. But that is available, and that's probably what they did with you, the testing. Yes?
I have a question. I've been going online and researching as much as I can, and there's all kinds of books out there with different physicians and authors. Is there a site you can go to find out if they're legitimate or credible physicians? I mean, the stuff they're writing about sounds great, but I have no idea if...
Yeah. So the question has to do with how do you really substantiate that what you're reading is valid? And because you're right, there are a lot of books out there about curing Alzheimer's disease or stopping Alzheimer's disease and so on and so forth. I would just encourage folks to go to websites that are from kind of solid institutions. Mayo Clinic has one. The Cleveland Clinic has one. HealthyBrains.org. The University of Washington has one. And I think the information that you'll get on these, well, the Alzheimer's Association has one. The NIH has one, the ADEAR site. So there's actually a number of internet sites that really are where you could definitely trust the information. Now that's not to say these books that they're really just kind of magic, that there's nothing to it. It's just that probably not always everybody agrees on the effect size of some of the things they recommend. So, but I think if you go to either the NIH website or any of these kind of institutions that are involved in Alzheimer's research, you probably will at least get, I think, information that's credible. Yes?
Yeah, I had a question. And what it's related to is you mentioned that commonly they lose short-term memories, but I'm observing as well that long-term memories are being lost, and worse, they're altered, and in dreams, it's like the dreams and their thoughts during the day will alter what they think they remember, and it causes problems because of that. Like a 50-year-old, 50 years ago, her parents died, but she still remembers today a letter or some communication that she's gotten from them. But it couldn't be anything other than a dream or something other than that.
Yeah. So what's brought up here is a very common phenomenon and occurs commonly in the disease. And I will say this, just kind of stepping back a bit, although the short-term memory is the first things that get involved, over time, as the disease progresses, then other abilities start to drop off too. And in fact, the way, and I think about it really pretty simplistically, so don't take it, take it with a grain of salt, but to me it's almost like marching back in development. So these things that you learn over time and memories that you accumulate start to get stripped away and jumbled. So people don't, first they can't get the timing of things right, what they remember, and then the memories may be totally incorrect. But the delusions, so thoughts that aren't grounded in reality, that your mother who died 50 years ago is still alive or whatever, are common, just common phenomenon. And there's a lot of behavioral, of course, probably many of you know as caregivers, a lot of behavioral problems that can occur. So between poor impulse control, that is flying off the handle, easily delusions, thoughts that aren't grounded in reality, even hallucinations, poor sleep, agitation. Unfortunately, all these are very common to occur in the anxiety, in the disease itself. And I will say this, though, even though we can't stop the disease process, we actually are pretty good at treating the behavioral problems. Now, some of that's, again, with medicine, but not all. So some of that is really by caregivers learning strategies to deal with it when it happens, so they don't get frustrated, because then everything just escalates, And it's interesting because people often, with Alzheimer's disease, they may not understand everything, but they can read your body language, and if you're getting upset, they'll get upset. So there's techniques that you can, that can be learned to deal with it. There's medicines that can help. But you bring up a good point, which is that these behavioral problems almost become the most important barrier in management and in caregiving. So that definitely will be a part of it.
How do you get across the brain-blood barrier with your dyes that you image?
Yeah.
And then there was a thing on the news hour the other night about using ultrasound to disrupt that brain-blood barrier.
Yeah. So the question has to do with the blood-brain barrier. Of course, the body, the way the body is set up is because the brain's so important. There actually is a barrier. It's actually a physical barrier that prevents toxins and things to get into the brain, but also will sometimes prevent chemicals to get in the brain as well. So one of the difficulties is getting drugs or things into the brain. We can get small chemicals in, and that's actually how the drugs we use, because they're small molecules, they can get in. But if you have larger molecules, you may get 5% of what you're giving actually into the brain. So people are looking at strategies to try to open up the blood-brain barrier so you can get more of the drug that you're delivering into the brain itself. And these right now are kind of in research, so it's not available, and these techniques are not available now, but people are looking at that to see if there's some way to deliver more drug to the brain and get past this barrier.
Two items. One, last summer, my wife got a PET here in Seattle, Virginia, Mason, and insurance did cover a really good chunk of it. I just wanted to put that out there so people think not to even consider that if insurance, and I think it was still $500, something like that. And I don't think we have any Cadillac insurance either, but that was good to hear for our purposes anyway. Second, I've heard different things about taking galantamine, donepezil, and how long it may be effective or worth taking, anything from 1 year, one and done, to take it as long as you can. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So two parts to this. One is that that PET scans can be covered, and the regular metabolic PET scan often is covered. In fact, that usually we don't have a lot of problem. Yeah, this is the one that looks at metabolism. It's really the PET amyloid imaging, which is the $6,000 one, that nobody covers at the moment, but hopefully they will. As far as the duration of using these drugs, these symptomatic drugs, how long should you use them? Here's the problem. The studies that were done with them, the longest study was a year. So there's no studies that have gone longer than a year. So that's why people say, it only gives you a year's worth, because nobody studied it further. And it turns out that so if you have two groups, so one placebo, one on the drug, so the drug goes up and then it goes down, the placebo just goes down. But at the year mark, the people that are on the drug are pretty much just back to their baseline. So in some sense, it's given you a year where you haven't declined, at least on testing, even though the conditions continues in the brain. But as far as we know, and this is with what are called open label studies, where we just follow people after the study and we just follow them along, there continues to be a benefit from these drugs from a functional standpoint. You'll get worse, the disease progresses, but people that take the drug seem to function at a higher level than those that don't.
Marguerite Richard, Seattle, Washington.
After her.
And I was concerned about how much of the medication is related to people that have suffered from strokes. I don't know if it's something that is combined, because like I said, if you're having a problem with dementia, oftentimes once you have had the stroke, some people's mind, they don't come back to 100% before they had the stroke. So I was kind of fishing around in that area, how much of the medication labels that you mentioned are related to people that actually have had strokes and are on the same medication.
Yeah, so the question has to do with people who have dementia due to strokes or vascular dementia, which, by the way, is the second most common cause of dementia and also is commonly associated with Alzheimer's disease. So there's this kind of overlap. So there were studies with people who have vascular dementia with some of these drugs initially. Again, this is almost 15 or 20 years ago. And the results are variable. So some people did get a benefit, and some people don't. So my own feeling with that for vascular dementia is that knowing that it may or may not help, it's certainly reasonable to try one of these drugs. But if you don't see a benefit within, after a couple months, then it may not be worth continuing. Whereas in Alzheimer's disease, or if you think there's an Alzheimer's component to it, then we would continue it, even though we don't see a tremendous improvement, because we think that it may maintain function higher. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. Oh, yes. Oh, we got one more. Okay.
What would you say is the holy grail for researchers right now in brain research for Alzheimer's? Is it the elimination of those proteins, the ability for getting people's bodies to be able to get rid of those, or what are they kind of pointing at right now?
Well, the most, again, there's division even in research circles, because there's a group that's still focused on the amyloid idea, and in fact, it just came back from a meeting last weekend where there's going to be a trial. We'll be part of it here in Seattle, taking individuals even earlier in the disease process when they have no symptoms and when they're just starting to build up the amyloid, and actually treating them with drugs that remove amyloid. And then the thought is, if you can remove it really early, you can, if not prevent, certainly delay the disease. So a lot of folks, that's still one of the major thrusts of treatment, of research. But there's other strategies people are looking at too. Some people say, you're wasting time with that. We need to look at other things. And we have another study here that in Seattle. It's a nationwide study looking, interestingly, at a kind of a bacterial toxin hypothesis, that the thought that there may be some bacterial toxins that accelerate the disease, and there's drugs that can block this toxin and so on. So It's wide open now, but there's a lot of interest in various strategies to treat Alzheimer's disease, but the amyloid theory is probably the most common one, and I think the one that there's probably the most activity in, even though we haven't been successful so far in the amyloid trials. Enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you very much.